The day I quit my job, I thought I was choosing freedom, but what I was really doing was loosening the last bolt holding my life in the shape everyone, including me, had agreed it should have. I remember the quiet afterward more than the argument that led up to it. The office door clicked shut behind me, and the city noise rushed in like it always did, indifferent and mechanical. I stood on the sidewalk with my resignation still warm in my pocket, feeling neither brave nor afraid, just strangely hollow. For years I had told myself that work was the spine of my identity, provider, problem solver, the dependable one. Without it, I expected panic. Instead, there was a soft, unsettling relief, like finally setting down a heavy bag and realizing my hands didn't know what to do without the weight. I didn't tell my wife right away. That's the part that still bothers me when I replay it. Not the quitting, that decision had been circling me for months, but the silence. I walked home slowly, rehearsing explanations that sounded reasonable, mature, responsible. Each version felt like a lie because it avoided the truth I didn't yet have language for. I was tired of being the man I had learned to perform. When I opened our apartment door, she was in the kitchen, barefoot, sleeves rolled up, humming to herself. The normalcy of it almost broke me. She looked at my face and knew immediately that something had shifted. She always had that sense, an ability to notice emotional weather changes before I did. "You're home early," she said, gently, not accusing. I nodded and set my keys down with more care than necessary. I quit. The word hung between us. She didn't gasp or raise her voice. She just leaned against the counter and studied me, as if measuring not the decision but the person standing in front of her. "Do you want to tell me why?" she asked. I did. I just didn't know how. What came out instead was a string of practical complaints: burnout, management, the feeling of being replaceable. All true, but incomplete. She listened without interrupting, which somehow made it harder. When I finished, she waited a beat longer than was comfortable. "That's not all," she said. It wasn't a question. Something in my chest tightened, and for a moment I considered doubling down, insisting that this was enough, that any more honesty would only complicate things. But the day had already cracked something open. I sat down at the table and pressed my palms flat against the wood, grounding myself. "I don't know who I am without it," I said. "Without being that." "That," she echoed softly. "The one who holds everything up. The one who's supposed to know what to do." She pulled out the chair across from me and "Saturday, you don't have to know right now," she said. "But we should probably find out together." At the time, I thought that was the end of it, a supportive conversation, the beginning of a practical reorganization of our lives. I had no idea it was the first step into a version of myself I had spent decades carefully ignoring. The weeks that followed were disorienting in small, quiet ways. Days lost their edges without work to divide them. I took over more of the house routines, cleaning, cooking, errands, not because we planned it that way, but because I was there. At first, I treated it like a temporary assignment, something to manage efficiently until I found my next role. But slowly, without ceremony, I began to notice how differently time moved when I wasn't racing it. My wife noticed too. She never framed it as praise or critique, just observations offered casually over dinner or while folding laundry together. "You seem calmer," she said once. "I feel less armored," I replied, surprising myself. She smiled at that, not triumphantly, but with curiosity. One evening, as we were sorting clothes, she held up a soft sweater of hers, nothing flashy, just something comfortable and worn in. "You always like the texture of this," she said, half teasing. I laughed it off. "I like good fabric. That's not illegal." She didn't push. She never pushed. That was part of what made everything that came later possible and complicated. There had always been small moments like that in my life, moments I catalogued and then dismissed. A pull toward gentler things. An ease with emotional labor that other men seemed to avoid. None of it felt dramatic enough to interrogate. I told myself it was just personality, just sensitivity. Labels were for other people. But without the structure of my job, those moments stopped being background noise. They became questions. One afternoon, she asked if I wanted to help her reorganize the bedroom closet. It was an ordinary task, but standing there among 2 lives' worth of clothing, I felt oddly exposed. Her clothes carried a history of choices, colors she liked, cuts that made her feel confident, outfits tied to specific memories. Mine felt utilitarian by comparison, like a uniform I had never thought to question. She caught me staring. "You okay?" she asked. "I don't know," I said honestly. "It feels like I've been wearing the same answer for a long time." She considered that, then said something that still echoes in me. Answers are allowed to change. That night, lying in bed, I realized how much of my identity had been constructed around obligation. Providing, protecting, performing stability. None of it was wrong. But it wasn't complete. And for the first time, I allowed myself to wonder, not what I wanted to escape, but what I might want to move toward. The transformation didn't announce itself with drama. It began as a conversation about roles, then expectations, then comfort. My wife never framed it as turning me into anything. If anything, she kept asking who I felt like when no one was watching. The answer took time. It took discomfort. It took moments of resistance where I worried about what this meant for our marriage, for how the world would see me, for whether I was being irresponsible or indulgent. Every step forward came with a quiet reckoning. Was I being honest, or was I hiding behind a new idea of myself? The irony wasn't lost on me that quitting my job, an act I thought would destabilize us, was what finally forced me to confront stability of a deeper kind. Not financial or social, but internal. I didn't know then where it would lead. I only knew that something in me was finally listening. And that listening would change everything. Change didn't arrive with a declaration. It seeped in through routine, through the unremarkable hours that used to belong to someone else's expectations. I woke earlier than my wife most days, not out of discipline but habit, and I'd sit at the kitchen table with coffee growing cold, watching light creep across the floor. Without the urgency of work, my thoughts wandered into places I'd kept fenced off. I began noticing how often my inner monologue softened when I imagined myself without the constant pressure to perform masculinity correctly, no stoicism checklist, no invisible scorecard. At first, I told myself this was just a phase of recalibration. Anyone who leaves a long-held role has to renegotiate their sense of self. That explanation felt safe, rational. But it stopped holding when my wife began involving me, intentionally, thoughtfully, in parts of her world I'd always observed from a respectful distance. It started with language. She'd ask, "How would you like to handle this?" instead of, "Can you do this for me?" The difference was subtle, but it shifted something. I wasn't assisting, I was participating. We talked more openly about emotional labor, about how much of it she'd been carrying quietly for years. These conversations weren't accusations. They were disclosures. And listening to her, I felt a mix of gratitude and shame, not because I'd been cruel or neglectful, but because I'd accepted imbalance as normal. One afternoon, while we were out running errands, she suggested we stop by a small home goods store she loved. I would usually drift toward the hardware aisle equivalent, letting her browse. This time, she handed me 2 options for throw pillows and asked which felt right. I remember holding them, surprised by how seriously I took the question. Texture, color, weight, these things mattered. I wasn't choosing to be agreeable, I was choosing honestly. "You have good instincts," she said, smiling. That word, instincts, lodged itself in my chest. It implied something internal, something I hadn't been trained to trust. Later that evening, we talked about the future. Money, timelines, logistics. Practical things. But underneath it all was a deeper negotiation. What did partnership look like if we stopped assuming our roles were fixed? She didn't propose anything radical. She just kept opening doors and letting me decide whether to walk through. The first door I hesitated at was vulnerability. I admitted to her that I'd always felt strangely disconnected from the idea of being the husband in the way culture often frames it. I loved her deeply. That wasn't in question. But the script of authority, emotional reserve, self-sacrifice without softness, had always felt like borrowed clothing. She listened, her expression thoughtful rather than alarmed. You know, she said, marriage isn't a costume party. You don't get points for wearing the outfit everyone expects. That night, I slept poorly, my mind replaying moments from my past, times I'd instinctively deferred, nurtured, adapted, then corrected myself for it. I realized how often I'd edited my reactions before they reached my face. The next step wasn't planned. It happened on a rainy afternoon when the apartment felt too quiet. We were sorting through old clothes to donate. I held up a shirt of mine, worn thin at the collar, and felt nothing. Then I picked up one of hers, simple, comfortable, familiar, and felt an unexpected sense of recognition. Not desire. Recognition. I feel ridiculous saying this, I began. She looked up. Say it anyway. I think I've been avoiding parts of myself because I didn't think I was allowed to have them. She didn't correct me or reframe it. She just asked, what parts? I struggled to articulate it without collapsing into stereotypes. It wasn't about clothes, not really. It was about permission, to inhabit softness without apology, to explore identity without turning it into spectacle or shame. She was quiet for a long moment, then said, carefully, what if we treated this like learning a new language instead of choosing a side? That metaphor steadied me. Learning implied mistakes, patience, growth. Not a binary switch, but a process. From then on, our conversations took on a new depth. We talked about gender not as an ideology but as an experience, how it's taught, reinforced, punished. She shared her own struggles with expectation, how femininity had been both a refuge and a cage for her. Listening to her, I realized this wasn't me crossing into her world. It was both of us interrogating the borders we'd inherited. The fear didn't vanish. If anything, it sharpened. I worried about friends, family, the quiet judgments of strangers. I worried about whether this exploration made me selfish at a time when I was already not contributing financially. Responsibility loomed over every question I asked myself. One evening, I voiced that fear. What if this is just me running away from accountability? She shook her head. Avoidance hides. This, she gestured between us, this is you showing up. That distinction mattered. It reframed my internal debate. Accountability wasn't about clinging to a role, it was about honesty and care. The first visible changes were small and private. Adjustments in how I moved through the day, how I spoke about myself. I allowed my emotional responses to exist without qualifying them. I noticed how relief followed, not euphoria, just relief, like releasing a breath I'd been holding unconsciously. I wasn't becoming someone else. I was meeting someone I'd been editing for a long time. And still, I didn't know where this would lead, or how far it would go. I only knew that my wife wasn't dragging me anywhere. She was walking beside me, attentive, occasionally challenging, always asking the question that mattered most, does this feel true? That question would test me more than any job ever had. The longer I stayed out of work, the more I understood that unemployment wasn't the crisis I'd feared, it was exposure. Without the daily armor of productivity, my inner life had nowhere to hide. Mornings stretched, and in that space, questions I'd postponed for years began asking themselves with increasing insistence. Not dramatic questions. Persistent ones. The kind that don't demand answers so much as attention. I started keeping a small notebook. It wasn't a journal in the earnest, confessional sense. It was more like a ledger of observations, what made me tense, what made me relax, where I felt resistance, where I felt ease. Patterns emerged. I noticed how my body softened when I allowed myself to be gentle, when I moved more slowly, when I listened without preparing a response, when I took care with domestic details I'd once treated as chores to be completed efficiently rather than experiences to inhabit. My wife noticed too, though she never framed it as progress. She framed it as noticing. You seem more present, she said once, not as a compliment but as a statement of fact. Presence had never been my strength. I had always been oriented toward outcomes, toward being useful. Presence felt like loitering in my own life. There were days when I resisted it. I'd wake with a familiar itch, the urge to fix something, to prove something. On those days, I'd scroll job postings and feel a tug of relief at the thought of slipping back into a known shape. But the postings read differently now. Titles that once felt aspirational felt constricting. Responsibilities that once made me proud felt oddly distant, like tasks from a previous life I'd outgrown without realizing it. I didn't tell my wife about every fluctuation. Not because I was hiding, but because I was learning discernment. I was discovering that not every internal tremor needed immediate translation into conversation. Some things needed to be lived first. Still, there were moments when the weight of uncertainty pressed hard. One afternoon, after a phone call with a former colleague who asked, casually, kindly, what my next move was, I felt a familiar shame rise. Not because I lacked ambition, but because I lacked a script. I ended the call politely and sat in silence, feeling smaller than I had in weeks. When my wife came home, she saw it immediately. She didn't ask what was wrong. She asked, "Do you want company, or do you want to talk?" I chose company. We cooked dinner together in near silence, the kind that doesn't strain to fill itself. Later, as we cleaned up, I finally said, "I don't know how to explain what I'm doing without it sounding like I'm lost." She dried her hands and looked at me. "Lost isn't the same as wrong," she said. "It just means the map stopped working." That night, we talked more explicitly about identity than we ever had. Not in theoretical terms, but personal ones. I told her about the moments in my past that suddenly made sense, the ease I felt in spaces coded as feminine, the discomfort I'd felt when expected to assert dominance I didn't feel. I was careful not to frame these as evidence of anything definitive. I wasn't trying to build a case. I was trying to tell the truth as I understood it. She listened with the same attentiveness she always brought to difficult conversations, but this time I noticed something else, relief. Not excitement. Relief. As if a door she'd been waiting near had finally opened. "I always felt like you were holding something back," she admitted. "Not from me. From yourself." That landed harder than any accusation could have. Because it wasn't about blame. It was about recognition. From then on, our dynamic shifted in ways that were subtle but profound. Decision-making became more collaborative, not because she demanded it, but because I no longer defaulted to leadership as a performance. I stopped assuming responsibility had to look a certain way. I began asking myself what integrity required in each moment, rather than what masculinity expected. The phrase, "turned me into her wife," wouldn't have made sense to me then. What was happening didn't feel like reversal or replacement. It felt like redistribution. Of labor. Of emotional attentiveness. Of authority. I found myself taking on tasks I'd once viewed as peripheral and discovering not only competence but meaning in them. Not as a role I was forced into, but as a set of skills I'd always possessed, but undervalued. There were moments of friction. Of course there were. Old habits don't dissolve quietly. Sometimes I bristled at feedback I would have accepted easily before, interpreting it as a challenge to my worth rather than an invitation to adjust. Sometimes she grew impatient with my overthinking, my tendency to intellectualize feelings that wanted to be felt. We argued, not explosively, but honestly. One argument stands out. I had spent the day spiraling about public perception, what friends would think if they noticed changes, what family would say if roles shifted further. I framed it as concern for her, for us. She let me talk until I ran out of words. Then she said, "You're asking the world for permission it can't give. And you're calling that responsibility." I wanted to push back. To defend my caution as maturity. But something in her tone, steady, not dismissive, made me pause. "What if," she continued, "we decide what's right here first, and then deal with the rest as it comes?" That question reframed everything. It didn't deny risk. It just refused to let fear be the primary decision-maker. Around that time, she began encouraging me to experiment, not with appearance in any dramatic sense, but with expression. How did I want to speak about myself? How did I want to move through shared spaces? How did I want to be seen by her, at least in private? The first time I allowed myself to accept care from her without reflexively trying to reciprocate immediately, it felt almost transgressive. I was used to balance sheets. If I received, I owed. Letting care be asymmetrical, even temporarily, challenged something deep in me. But it also revealed how exhausting constant self-justification had been. I began to understand that much of my previous identity had been built around avoidance, avoiding dependence, avoiding softness, avoiding ambiguity. Letting those things in didn't make me weaker. It made me more accurate. There were nights when I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering where the line was, between exploration and erasure, between growth and abdication. Was I becoming something new, or simply allowing something old to surface? The question mattered to me because it spoke to accountability. I didn't want to abandon the person I'd been. I wanted to integrate him. One evening, I said as much to my wife. I don't want to disappear, I told her. I just don't want to. Keep pretending. She took my hand. You're not disappearing, she said. You're consolidating. That word stayed with me. Consolidation implied coherence. Less fragmentation. More truth in fewer pieces. By the end of that period, weeks that felt both endless and fleeting, I realized something quietly radical. My sense of worth was no longer tethered solely to output. I was learning to value myself as a participant in shared life, not just a contributor measured by visible metrics. That shift didn't make me complacent. It made me careful. Intentional. More aware of the impact of my choices on the people I loved. The world outside our apartment hadn't changed. Expectations still existed. Judgments still loomed. But inside, a different economy was forming, one based on honesty, responsiveness, and mutual respect rather than prescribed roles. I didn't yet know how far this transformation would go, or what form it would ultimately take. I only knew that returning to my old life unchanged was no longer an option, not because my wife demanded something different, but because I did. And that realization carried both relief and responsibility in equal measure. The first time I realized the world was beginning to notice, it wasn't dramatic. No confrontation. No pointed question. It was a pause, half a second too long, when an acquaintance ran into us at the grocery store and tried to orient herself to the version of me standing there. I hadn't changed much outwardly, not in any way that would read as declarative. But something about my posture, my attentiveness, the way I stood slightly angled toward my wife rather than squared off beside her, seemed to register as unfamiliar. On the walk home, I replayed the interaction in my head, cataloging every gesture. Old reflexes flared, self-surveillance, self-correction. Had I said too little? Too much? Had I sounded uncertain? The urge to tighten back into a recognizable shape was strong. My wife noticed my silence. You're spiraling, she said gently. I'm just aware, I replied. She nodded. Awareness is fine. Don't let it turn into self-erasure. That distinction became a kind of mantra. I was learning that social awareness didn't have to mean social obedience. It could mean discernment, knowing when to engage, when to explain, and when to simply exist without annotation. Around that time, our financial conversations grew more serious. Savings aren't infinite, and uncertainty has a way of sharpening priorities. I suggested, more than once, that I should take the first job that would have me, even if it meant stepping back into a role that no longer fit. Each time, she asked the same question, is that about stability, or is it about fear? It was never a comfortable question. Sometimes the answer was both. Responsibility isn't abstract when rent is due. I didn't want my exploration to become a burden she quietly absorbed. That concern was real, and it mattered. So we made a plan, temporary, flexible, grounded in reality. I took on more of the invisible labor at home, not as a trade-off, but as recognition that contribution takes many forms. I handled logistics, scheduling, budgeting, the small daily frictions that accumulate unnoticed. For the first time, I saw clearly how much work it was, not because I'd never helped before, but because I was now responsible for the continuity of it. That responsibility changed me. It demanded attentiveness, anticipation, emotional regulation. Skills I'd always associated with leadership in theory, but rarely practiced in this register. I found myself thinking ahead not in terms of outcomes, but in terms of people, how decisions would land, what they would require emotionally. The more I inhabited that space, the more I understood why my wife sometimes spoke of exhaustion in ways I hadn't fully grasped before. Carrying the emotional architecture of a shared life is heavy, especially when it's unacknowledged. Taking on that weight didn't diminish me. It grounded me. It also complicated things. There were moments when resentment flickered, not toward her, but toward the culture that had taught me to undervalue this kind of work until I was doing it. I felt angry at how narrow my earlier definitions of worth had been, and embarrassed by how easily I'd accepted them. One evening, after a particularly long day of coordinating appointments and smoothing over a family misunderstanding, I admitted to her, "I think I finally understand why you used to come home so tired." She smiled, but there was something else there too: validation. "Understanding doesn't erase the past," she said. "But it does change the future." As my internal landscape shifted, so did my relationship to gendered expectations. Not in an abstract, academic way, but in the practical grammar of daily life. I noticed how often people deferred to me out of habit, even when I wasn't the one best positioned to decide. I began redirecting those moments, inviting collaboration instead of default authority. Sometimes that was received well. Sometimes it caused confusion. The hardest conversations were with family. We didn't announce anything. There was no declaration to make. But subtle changes invite questions, and questions invite assumptions. When a relative joked about me being domesticated, I laughed politely and felt a familiar sting. The old me would have overcompensated, asserted something, reclaimed ground. This time, I let the comment pass and paid attention to what it stirred. Later, I told my wife about it. "I don't know when to correct people," I said. "Or if I should." She thought about it. "You don't owe anyone a lesson," she said. "But you do owe yourself honesty." That became the metric. Not comfort. Not approval. Honesty. Privately, our relationship deepened in ways that surprised me. With roles less rigid, intimacy took on a different texture, quieter, more mutual. I felt seen not for what I provided, but for how I participated. I also felt more accountable. Without the shield of a prescribed role, my choices were unmistakably mine. There were days when I missed the simplicity of being told who to be. Ambiguity is demanding. It requires constant recalibration. But I also recognized that the simplicity I missed had come at the cost of numbness. This was harder, yes, but it was alive. At some point, a shift occurred that I hadn't anticipated. I stopped framing my experience as trying something new, and started understanding it as aligning something old. The language I used internally changed. I no longer thought in terms of borrowing or imitating. I thought in terms of expressing and integrating. One night, as we were getting ready for bed, my wife said something casually that landed with unexpected force. "You know," she said, "I don't feel like I married a different person. I feel like I finally get to be married to you." I didn't respond right away. My throat tightened, not with sadness, but with the weight of being recognized. That sentence reframed months of uncertainty. It suggested continuity where I'd feared rupture. Still, the path ahead wasn't clear. We hadn't yet confronted the broader social consequences in any sustained way. Friends, work, the public world, all of it loomed, waiting for a version of me that hadn't fully solidified. I knew the next phase would require decisions that couldn't remain private forever. But for the first time, I trusted that whatever form those decisions took, they would be grounded in something sturdier than obligation. They would be grounded in intention. And intention, I was learning, is a responsibility of its own. The hardest part wasn't becoming someone new. It was realizing how much of my old life had been organized around being unquestioned. When you step out of a role that society understands instinctively, you inherit a new kind of visibility, not the loud kind, but the kind that quietly invites interpretation. People watch more closely. They fill in blanks you didn't know you were leaving. It began with friends. Invitations shifted in tone before they shifted in frequency. Conversations that once orbited careers and achievements now paused when it was my turn to speak, as if my answers might require translation. Some friends adapted easily, asking thoughtful questions or simply accepting the new cadence of my life without comment. Others struggled. Not with hostility, exactly, but with confusion that came out sideways, jokes that landed awkwardly, advice I hadn't asked for, reassurance I didn't need. I learned quickly that explanation is labor. Every time I tried to narrate my internal changes in a way that would make sense to someone else, I felt myself flattening the experience, sanding off its nuance to fit a familiar shape. I began choosing my moments carefully. Not secrecy, selectivity. I wasn't ashamed. I was conserving energy. My wife and I talked about this often. About how to be legible without becoming performative. About when silence is self-respect and when it becomes avoidance. She never pressured me to be an ambassador for anything. If anything, she reminded me that no one ever owes the public a perfectly articulated version of their becoming. Still, there were moments when silence felt like complicity. A dinner with friends stands out. Someone made a casual remark about men these days needing to step up, the implication clear and narrow. Old instincts kicked in, I could feel the familiar urge to nod, to align myself with the comment to avoid friction. Instead, I paused. Not dramatically. Just long enough. I think stepping up can look different than we've been taught, I said. The table went quiet. Not hostile. Curious. A few people nodded. The conversation moved on. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a correction. But it mattered, to me. It was the first time I'd publicly resisted a definition that no longer fit without apologizing for it. Afterward, my wife squeezed my hand under the table. That small gesture carried more affirmation than any external approval could have. Internally, the transformation continued to deepen. I noticed how my emotional responses had become less defended. I cried more easily, not often, but honestly. I apologized more quickly, without rehearsing justifications. I listened with less urgency to fix. These weren't skills I'd lacked before, but they'd been constrained, rationed by an internal rulebook that equated restraint with strength. Strength, I was learning, had far more to do with responsiveness than rigidity. At home, our dynamic evolved again. The redistribution of responsibility had settled into something that felt less like experimentation and more like habit. I managed schedules and emotional check-ins with a fluency that surprised me. My wife trusted me with decisions that affected both of us, not because I asserted authority, but because I demonstrated care. Trust, I realized, is built less on certainty than on attunement. There were moments when she challenged me directly. Not unkindly. When I hesitated too long over a decision, afraid of making the wrong one, she'd say, indecision is still a choice. When I softened so much that I avoided conflict altogether, she reminded me that gentleness doesn't require self-erasure. Those corrections mattered. They kept my transformation from tipping into passivity. I wasn't learning how to disappear. I was learning how to show up differently. The phrase that would later become shorthand, "my wife turned me into her wife," didn't exist yet, but the dynamic it gestured toward was taking shape. Not as imitation, and certainly not as coercion, but as alignment. I was inhabiting a relational posture that had long been coded feminine, emotional stewardship, anticipatory care, domestic continuity, and discovering not only aptitude, but integrity in it. What startled me most was how this shift clarified my sense of masculinity rather than erasing it. Traits I'd once associated exclusively with being a man, reliability, accountability, resilience, didn't vanish. They reoriented. They stopped orbiting dominance and started orbiting service. Not servitude. Service. The difference is consent. The outside world didn't always understand that distinction. Some relatives expressed concern, thinly veiled as jokes or nostalgia for how things used to be. One asked my wife, privately, if she was comfortable with how things were changing. When she told me about it later, I felt a flare of anger, not at the question itself, but at the assumption beneath it, that my growth must be her loss. She said yes, my wife told me, smiling. Very. That affirmation mattered, but it also carried responsibility. I was acutely aware that my exploration had ripple effects. I wasn't alone in this. Every choice I made intersected with her life, her social standing, her emotional safety. I checked in often, sometimes too often. She reminded me that trust means believing her when she says she's okay. The most difficult reckoning came when I began thinking seriously about work again. Not just employment, but vocation, how I wanted to spend my time and energy in the world. The idea of returning to my old field felt increasingly untenable, not because I couldn't do it, but because I couldn't do it without fragmenting myself again. At the same time, the prospect of pivoting raised practical fears. Financial vulnerability is real. Ideals don't pay rent. We approached the decision methodically, together. We ran numbers. We set boundaries. We talked about timelines and contingency plans. Responsibility returned to the conversation, not as a cudgel, but as a shared value. I realized then that my fear of irresponsibility had been less about money and more about legitimacy. I wanted proof that my transformation wasn't indulgent, that it produced something tangible. The proof came quietly. In the steadiness of our home. In the depth of our conversations. In the way conflict resolved more cleanly because it was addressed earlier. In the way I felt less fractured, more congruent. One evening, as we sat on the couch after a long day, my wife rested her head on my shoulder and said, almost absent-mindedly, "You know, I don't feel like I'm carrying this alone anymore." That sentence landed with weight. Not because it praised me, but because it named the ethical core of what was happening. This wasn't about identity for identity's sake. It was about equity. About presence. About the moral dimension of how two people share a life. I thought back to the day I quit my job, to the hollowness I'd felt on the sidewalk. I understood now that the emptiness hadn't been absence, it had been space. Space I'd been afraid to fill without a script. Space that, slowly and carefully, had become a place where something more honest could take root. I still didn't have all the language. Labels felt provisional at best. But I had something sturdier than certainty. I had alignment between my inner life and my outer actions, between my values and my relationships. And I had learned something that felt both personal and universal: transformation that lasts is rarely loud. It happens through sustained attention, through ethical negotiation with the people we love, through the courage to let go of identities that no longer serve our integrity. The final stretch, I knew, would require me to step fully into the world as this more integrated version of myself, to face consequences, to claim responsibility without hiding behind old definitions. I wasn't afraid of that anymore. Stepping fully back into the world didn't happen all at once. It happened the way most irreversible things do, incrementally, then suddenly. A conversation here. A choice there. A moment when I realized that the version of myself I'd been protecting no longer existed in a way that could be restored, even if I wanted it to be. The first public decision I made from this new internal alignment was about work. Not where I would go next, but how I would choose. I stopped asking which role would validate me fastest and started asking which one I could inhabit without fracture. That narrowed the field dramatically. It also slowed everything down. There were rejections. Some explicit, some implied. I sensed when interviewers couldn't quite place me, when my answers didn't match the expected tempo of ambition or authority. I didn't correct them. I wasn't trying to be misunderstood, but I also wasn't interested in contorting myself back into legibility at the cost of coherence. Through it all, my wife remained steady, not cheerleading, not rescuing, just present. When I doubted myself, she didn't rush to reassure. She asked questions that returned me to my values. Would you respect yourself doing that? Would that make our life more honest or just more comfortable? Those questions were harder than criticism. They required me to answer with integrity rather than defensiveness. Eventually, I found work that fit, not perfectly, but honestly. A role that valued attentiveness, coordination, emotional intelligence. Skills I'd once minimized, now recognized as assets. The first paycheck wasn't a triumph. It was a quiet confirmation. I could contribute without disappearing. With that stability came a new wave of visibility. Colleagues noticed how I operated, how I mediated conflict, how I listened, how I prioritized collective outcomes over personal credit. Some respected it. Some found it disconcerting. I stopped trying to manage their reactions. My responsibility was to my conduct, not their comfort. Family relationships evolved unevenly. A few people surprised me with their adaptability. Others maintained a polite distance, unsure how to engage without familiar reference points. I learned to grieve that without turning it into a referendum on my choices. Not everyone is able to follow you through a transformation, even when it's ethical and grounded. That doesn't mean you were wrong to change. What mattered most was what happened at home. Over time, the dynamic that had once felt like a quiet experiment settled into something unremarkable, and that was the point. Our life became less about who was doing which role and more about how we were caring for each other. We stopped narrating it. We lived it. There were still disagreements. Still stress. Still moments when old patterns tried to reassert themselves. But we met those moments with more skill now. Less panic. More repair. I had learned how to apologize without self-abasement, how to assert myself without dominance, how to receive care without tallying it as debt. At some point, a friend, trying to be funny, said, "So what, you quit your job and your wife turned you into her wife?" The room went quiet, waiting for my reaction. I smiled, not because the phrasing was accurate, but because it revealed something true in a distorted way. "No," I said calmly. "I quit pretending I only had one way to be useful. And my wife didn't turn me into anything. She just didn't stop me from becoming more honest." Later that night, I thought about that moment for a long time. About how easily people reach for transformation narratives that center power, who changes whom, who wins, who loses. What they miss is the ethical core, that real transformation isn't about control. It's about consent, reflection, and responsibility. Looking back, I don't romanticize the process. It was uncomfortable. It cost me certainty, status, and a version of myself that had once felt safe. But it gave me something far more durable: alignment. The ability to look at my life and recognize myself in it without flinching. I understand now that identity isn't a destination. It's a practice. One that requires ongoing attention, humility, and care, for oneself and for others. The moral work isn't in choosing the right label or role. It's in acting with integrity once you know more about who you are. If there's anything I hope this story offers, it's not instruction, but permission. Permission to question scripts that no longer fit. Permission to value emotional labor as real labor. Permission to grow without needing your transformation to be dramatic or legible to everyone else. The day I quit my job, I thought I was stepping into uncertainty. What I was actually stepping into was responsibility, of a deeper, more human kind. And for the first time in my life, that responsibility felt like home.